Why Europeans must do everything in their power to help Ukraine stand up to Russia.
It's called war fatigue. Historians refer to the year 1917 during the First World War, marked by the exhaustion of the belligerents and the mutinies that led to revolution in Russia. There is certainly nothing similar yet on the plains of the Donbass. But the weariness is becoming more obvious after almost 2 years of fighting in a conflict of attrition, with huge losses on both sides of some 950 kilometers of largely fixed front lines. Western services estimate Russian losses at least 150,000 men put out of action. The Ukrainian authorities refuse to give the slightest figure for their own losses, but they too are said to number in the tens of thousands, and discouragement is palpable in Kiev after the failure of this summer's counteroffensive, which failed to make any significant headway against the imposing Russian defense lines. As a result, doubts are growing among Ukraine's Western allies about Kiev's real ability to win this war. In their most pessimistic scenarios, they even mention the possibility, if not of a defeat, at least of a lasting stalemate in this conflict. This is leading to a growing demobilization of public opinion in both the United States and the 27 countries of the European Union.
Faced with Russia, the EU 27 must remain mobilized.
Resistance to Russian aggression is vital for Ukraine, and it is also vital for Europe. But Europe is insufficiently aware of this, and above all, is not drawing all the consequences. In mid-December, a European summit will be held in Brussels to decide whether to open accession negotiations with Kiev. This decision must be taken unanimously by the 27 member states, which has not yet been achieved due to opposition from Hungary, governed by Viktor Orban, an explicit supporter of Putin within the EU. There is talk of a two-stage approach, with a political agreement by the 27 in a few days' time, followed by a new assessment in March 2024. Such a postponement would send out the wrong political signal. There are still things to be done in terms of the fight against corruption and the protection of minorities, but Ukraine is determined and will be ready by mid-December, stressed the Commission Vice President responsible for values, the Czech Věra Jourová, on her return from Kiev. The Europeans need to make a strong gesture, and any further delay in opening up this process will be seen by Moscow as a sign of weakness, all the more so as populists are on the rise throughout the European Union, and this will have an impact on the composition of the next European Parliament following the June 2024 elections, as well as on the new Commission. In February 2022, the 27 member states reacted immediately and unanimously to the Russian aggression, despite Hungary's reluctance. Thanks to their support and the sacrifices of its fighters, Ukraine held out against all the odds, blocking the Russian offensive on Kiev, and even liberating part of the occupied territories around Kharkiv in the northeast and Kherson in the south in autumn 2022. The Russian army then had to bury itself in defense. Despite the weapons supplied to Kiev, always late and always in insufficient quantities, the war ground to a halt.
Giving Kiev the means for victory.
These very real successes are nonetheless the result of a combination of exceptional factors: an American administration led by a president who listens to Europe, a veteran Cold War president who knows the grammar perfectly, and large available military stocks inherited from before the fall of the Berlin Wall. Admittedly, with some 85 billion euros of civil and military aid given to Ukraine, Europe is doing its part with dignity and giving more overall than the United States. But when it comes to military supplies, the United States is still inescapable. The 27, and Germany in particular, are unable, for example, to supply the million shells promised. Only a third have been delivered. Meanwhile, Russia has switched to a war economy, with military spending accounting for over 30% of the budget. Europeans, taken as a whole, still spend only 1.5% of their GDP on their armed forces, far below the stated, and already inadequate, target of 2%. The United States has the excuse of being on all fronts, in the Middle East and Asia. For Ukraine, 2024 will be the year of all dangers. The question of full support for Kiev over the long term is therefore becoming increasingly important. It is no longer enough to allow the Ukrainians to resist. They must be given the means to regain the upper hand. The Russian army has over 1.5 million soldiers under arms. Ukraine can barely muster a third. The average age of Ukrainian soldiers at the front is 43. Hence the cry of alarm from the charismatic chief of staff Valery Zaluzhnyi in an interview with The Economist, referring to the military stalemate on both sides and the risk of exhaustion.
The shadow of negotiations between Kiev and Moscow.
Russia now feels in a position of strength both militarily, despite the failure of its offensives, and diplomatically. Its economy, boosted by military spending, is operating at full capacity. Vladimir Putin is convinced that time is now on his side, and that he will win what the Kremlin's narrative defines as a collective war of the West against Russia through Ukraine, although Russia's domestic product is somewhere between that of Spain and Italy, which pales in comparison with the combined weight of the United States, the European Union and the United Kingdom. But Putin knows what he wants. He is neither a great strategist nor a particularly intelligent man, but he is very, very determined, sums up Konstantin Stelzenmuller, director of the Brookings Institution in Washington. This clear hierarchy of priorities is sorely lacking in the West, and their unity is cracking. Some even question the possibility of negotiations with Moscow. Experts on both sides of the Atlantic and in Europe, including the former Secretary-General of NATO Anders Fogh Rasmussen, believe that if Ukraine is unable to reclaim its territories under Russian occupation, it should negotiate to save the remaining 80%, even if it means abandoning to Russia the regions that have already been annexed. In exchange, Ukraine would join NATO and the EU, offering real and substantial security guarantees. This scenario is also being mooted in Kiev by many of the regime's opponents. It's not war or peace, but war or voucher. For the moment, this is all political fiction. None of the parties involved has any interest in a compromise, first and foremost Russia, which is hoping for a Donald Trump victory in the American presidential election in November 2024, and which has made no secret of its opposition to support for Ukraine. Ukraine's Western allies, for their part, point out that the decision on whether or not to open negotiations rests first and foremost with the Ukrainians, while President Volodymyr Zelensky continues to state loud and clear that he wants to reconquer all Ukrainian territory, while acknowledging on occasion that it will be difficult to reintegrate the Donbass into the liberated Ukraine. But despite their doubts and fatigue, the Ukrainians remain convinced that they have no choice. For us, the issue is not war or peace, but war or voucher, says a Ukrainian diplomat lapidary, referring to the town near Kiev where the Russian occupiers multiplied their atrocities. It's a reality that Westerners need to be aware of. Ukraine's freedom is also Europe's freedom.